Hi everyone, welcome to this example interview question for biology. I'm Shivi. I'm a current biology student at the University of Oxford in second year, and this is just kind of a broad yet comprehensive interview question, example interview that we're going to be going through. And I think it should be a good sort of indication of what interview questions for biology at Oxford are like, because I think it covers a lot of aspects that different interviewers can ask you, but it's probably going to be longer and more comprehensive than an interview that you actually have is going to be. But I just want to show you all aspects of what you can get asked. So let's get on with it. So my opening question would be briefly, how would you describe this bird, which is a long-tailed widow bird here? So just take a couple of minutes to think about that. Um, yeah. Uh, Well, in terms of a hint, obviously this is a very broad opening question, and I think those are quite common for biology, like just sort of an opening. I guess maybe to make you a bit more comfortable as well, it's quite useful for the interview to put in quite a broad opening question, and you can't really get anything wrong at this stage because there's no right or wrong answers if you're just describing a bird. But my biggest tip really with a question like this would be to start off quite broad. For example, you would obviously say it's got a very long tail. I mean, that's in the name. But start off with a bigger picture and then zoom into like different key details. So, for example, you could talk about the striking pattern on the bird's chest, and really you should start to think about why the bird might have these features, really from an evolutionary perspective. So why does the bird actually look like this, and why may this striking design have evolved? Like it's quite unique, clearly, but why might that actually be the case, and why might the bird have been selected to have these features in its environment? So you should really start thinking about that, and obviously throughout the interview you really want to be explaining your reasoning. We'll go into this in further detail in a minute, but you really want to be talking about why you think what you think, and sort of showing your reasoning at all times. So, as I say, for the answer, start off really broad. Of course, it's got an extremely long tail. You might say it's about 3 times the size of the body, but really talk about why when you mention that. So, do you think maybe the tail could help with stability? Could it be sexual selection? So, has the tail evolved to attract mates? Um, or is it even something as simple as maybe a longer tail might make the bird quicker? And even to that question, you could ask yourself, why would the bird be selected to be quicker? And of course, the obvious answer for that would be to catch prey or escape predators. So yeah, as I was saying earlier, you can really say anything you want as long as you just back it up with logical thinking and like sound science. You're not expected to know the answer. There isn't really a correct answer. It's really just say what you see and explain why that might have evolved, and really think of everything they ask you really from an evolutionary perspective. And as I was alluding to earlier, really the biggest tip with Oxbridge interviews in general is think out loud. So you really want to be saying what you're thinking and sort of showing your logic and your thought process at all times. And then once you've started off broad, you can start to zoom into details. So, for example, you might notice that this individual has a furry head, and as I mentioned earlier, it's got that striking orange and white pattern on its chest. So again, you might mention that, and then ask yourself why would this have evolved? So maybe it would be a good exercise for you to pause the video here and maybe think of a couple more features on your own as to regarding the bird's appearance and why that might have evolved specifically. Okay, so question two, again, this one is quite broad as well. Do you think this bird is a male or a female, and why? If you lean towards either, then why would you believe that? So just take a couple of seconds to think about that and what you might say in response to that. I would say at this point as well, don't be nervous or afraid of silence during an interview. So if you need to take a couple of minutes, maybe 1.5 minutes maximum, to just think about what you might say in response to a particular question, then don't worry. You should really kind of build a solid idea of what you're going to say before you start saying it. So moving on to my hint. Again, as I said, it's another broad question, and you're not expected to know the answer. Really, they just want you to be able to show that you can come up with sound scientific answers which are backed by logic and reasoning. And just explain that to the tutor. Just explain what you're thinking and why what you're thinking is logical and could be a good answer. And again, you can argue for either side. There's no, well, there is a correct answer with this one, but there's no judgment for getting it wrong as long as you can, back up what you're saying and ask yourself why. So if you're leaning towards either answer, then you should ask yourself, why do I think that this particular feature might, make it more likely that this individual is a male, and why might this particular feature make it more likely that it's a female? So, and another important point is if you're halfway through your argument and you realize that maybe you're wrong, or your initial idea was wrong, or you contradict yourself, then don't worry. That's completely fine. But just explain to the tutor that you've changed your mind, you've thought about it a bit further, and you've realized whatever you said might not have been correct, might not have been logical, and you've come up with a new theory of sorts. And they just want to be able to see that you're able to think reasonably and logically, without sort of just overlooking that fact. So don't think that you've like committed to a certain answer just because you've said it, even if you realise that maybe it was illogical, or it maybe wasn't completely correct. You don't have to feel like you have to stick with your initial answer, and that really applies to all biology questions really. If you've started saying a particular thing but you no longer believe in it, then just explain that to the tutor. So I've just got a couple examples here where you might argue for either. So you might say a long tail might attract female mates, but then again I want to reflect back onto what I was saying earlier. Just ask yourself why. Why would a female look for a longer tail in a mate? Why might that response have evolved? But on the other hand, if you were going to argue for a female, maybe what you might say is a long tail might help with egg laying. So first of all, obviously mechanistically, you might want to say, why would a long tail help with egg laying? But once you've thought about that, go back to the evolutionary sense and say, why is that an advantage, and why would that be selected for in evolution? So just try and bring that back to the wider picture again. So really what I'm trying to show you here is you start off broad, you zoom in, and then you also link back to the bigger picture. So always bring it back to the evolutionary response, especially in a question like this where when you're talking about a specific individual or a specific species and its appearance and phenotype. And again, it might be a good idea to pause the video here and think of a couple more examples arguing for either side, and then asking yourself, well, why would this actually be advantageous, and why would this be selected for in evolution? So feel free to do that. Moving on. Okay, so the answer for this actually was that individual was a male. And here is a female on the right for comparison. A female on the right for comparison. So when you see these two individuals of different sexes, you might even think that they're not from the same species, but they actually are. So the reason that the male has evolved to be so strikingly different to the female is actually sexual selection. So it's evolved this design to be appealing for a female to mate with, because remember that in a reproductive event, it's really the female that's doing most of the work, right? It's a much larger investment for the female than it is for the male. Even if you think of this on a cellular level, like during reproduction, the sperm is a much smaller cell compared to the egg. So even just that is, a massive difference in the amount of energy and time it takes to make that one gamete. But on a much more macro level, it's usually going to be the female that's providing the parental care, of course, the one, that's going to be pregnant and laying the egg and really like looking after the offspring once they've hatched. So it's a big decision for them. So they want to ensure that the individual that they're mating with is of a good quality, quote unquote, um, so that they can ensure that their own offspring also have these qualities and are able to further propagate their genes. Because coming back to the evolutionary, wider picture, that's really what animals or all organisms want to do, is propagate their genes down generations and ensure their gene survival. That links into the selfish gene theory, and maybe that's something that I would really advise you guys to read up on, especially if you want something quite impressive to mention in your personal statement or in your interview. But coming back to this example, really all of these ideas here, they're quite advanced, and a tutor's not going to expect you to know them, but that you can start to come up with the bare bones of these theories just through simple logical thinking and reasoning. So for example, this might have evolved because of something called the handicap principle, which basically states that the long tail might actually hinder the bird's ability to fly. It might make the bird slower in catching its prey or slower in getting away from a predator. But the fact that the individual has been able to survive with this hampered phenotype, um, and is still able to survive and reproduce with the female, might show the female that, oh, even though this male has got this massive um, handicap, that it's able to survive, and therefore that must mean that it has other good genes. So this links to the good gene theory as well. If it can survive despite its handicap, then it must be a strong individual overall, and this is a quality that the female is going to want in its offspring. Um, but on the other hand, it might just be an ornament, and that's just something where, for some arbitrary reason, the female has evolved to just like the look of a longer tail and the striking features on the male's chest. So you can kind of come up with the bare bones of these theories just by talking to the tutor, and they'll guide you towards this principle as well. It's not like they're going to just expect you to come up with a massive new theory, but it's just, if you voice your reasoning and you voice your logic, it's very likely that you can come to an answer like this. And that's even, not even thinking about sexual selection, even deciding whether the individual is a male or a female. They're going to be able to help you in deciphering that. So moving on. So now I want to move on to really what would be the main question in an interview, in this example. So for the main question, I just want to say that this graph shows tail length on the x-axis. So in this experiment by Anderson in 1982 in Nature, these long-tailed widow birds were captured from the same environment, treated to either have their tails shortened from where they were before, and these are males that they're capturing, obviously, um, or have their tails elongated by using the cut that they would have taken from the shortened individuals and attaching it to the elongated individuals. And there was also two control groups as well, and then they were all released. And before doing this experiment, they measured the number of nests or territories that each individual had, and then they did the same after the experiment as well. So really, I just want you to describe this graph. If the interviewer was to ask you, just talk about this graph and talk me through the results, then what do you think you would say? So just take a couple of minutes to think about that. Okay, so my first hint is really, as I said, take 1 or 2 minutes just to take the graph in and think about what you're going to say exactly. You should try and aim to speak for about 2 minutes straight after this, describing the graph in as much detail as you can. But do start broad. Don't go into explanations or any potential issues you might see with the method or the graph itself. Just describe, what do the axes show. So we've already said that the x-axis shows what's actually happened to each individual. So have they had their tail shortened? Has the tail been kept the same, or has the tail been elongated? But what does the y-axis show? The y-axis shows the number of nests or the number of territories that each individual has observed to have. Um, and then you can go into, what do the results show? So is there a decrease in number of nests, or is there an increase in the number of nests? So you can say, obviously, for the shortened tails, there's a decrease in nests, but for the elongated um, individuals, there's an increase in the number of nests. So going in further, you really then want to go into the reasoning. So why might we see that, especially based upon what we were discussing earlier? So really, everything that the interviewer mentions to you throughout the interview is of relevance to further questions. So we discussed earlier that a longer tail is more appealing to a female. So that very obviously explains these results. Because if you really think about it, what is the number of nests a proxy measure for? It's a proxy measure to show us if an individual with a certain treatment is able to find a female mate. So really, what we're measuring here is sexual appeal, because you can't measure sexual appeal directly. That's kind of a hard thing to measure. We measure the number of nests that the individual is seen creating or living in as a proxy for sexual appeal, because if it's got a nest, then it means it's reproduced, and therefore it must have some certain level of sexual appeal. So thus, why do you think that the shortened tails show lower nest numbers and vice versa for the elongated tails? I think based upon what we were saying earlier, the answer should be fairly obvious. And then once you've answered that, again, you want to speak for about 2 minutes, letting the interviewer guide you and stop you, of course. Then you want to go into any potential issues that you might see with the method. And really, I think the key to this graph, and really the whole reason why they might ask this question in the first place, is why do you think that we see a lower nest number even for the controls, which have had no change in the size of their tail? This is quite an interesting result, and one that you might have to think about a bit further. So again, at this stage, maybe you want to pause the video and have another think about why they might decrease even in control groups. So as we were discussing earlier, clearly if a tail is elongated, a male is more attractive, and therefore reproduction increases, and therefore it has more nests. And then the opposite is true for the males with shorter tails. So from this graph, we can really conclude that females are attracted to longer tails. But really getting to the nub of the question, why do we see a decrease in the number of controls? Well, this is where the information given to you earlier comes into play. We said earlier that the birds were taken from the same environment, so it might just be the fact that because there were so many nests and reproduction events for the males with elongated tails, it could just be the case that there was not enough females left over in the environment to mate with the individuals that had no change. So it's because all of the females kind of flocked to the elongated individuals that these individuals may have been left without reproduction. So this might mean that our results for the shortened tails might not even be conclusive or valid, because again, that might just be as a result of there not being enough females to mate with these individuals. So this shortened group might have the same effect on it as the control and both the control groups. So therefore, maybe our results aren't even valid. However, then you could counter that with the fact that it seems that the shortened individuals have definitely lower nests after the treatment in comparison to both controls. So that could maybe bring it back a little bit. Maybe another point to consider is that these individuals had lower reproductive events following the treatment, because somehow individuals may become less attractive after being handled and captured by humans, maybe in terms of scent, or maybe their appearance has changed in some minor way that we can't detect, but might be quite impactful for a female to detect. So these are all things that you might be able to mention. And then maybe right at the end, you can talk about the validity of the graph. So this is quite clearly a very small sample size, because it only goes up to 2 on the y-axis, and it's done in the same environment. So that might be stochastic. Maybe it's due to chance. There's no statistic test done on the results. Maybe you can talk about what statistics tests you might want to use for these results. And of course, maybe the obvious one is that there were no repeats done, but there's many more that you can definitely think of. And again, I'd urge you to pause the video here and think of any other reasons for why this might not have been a valid study. So thank you for watching, and I hope that was a helpful sort of insight into how biology interviews might work at Oxford, and what, the kinds of questions you might be asked. Again, you're not going to get asked that much about just one example. I just wanted to be a bit comprehensive as to the different types of questions that you might get. So hopefully that was helpful, and good luck in your interviews, and I hope you excel.